For the next part of our presentation, we've got the man himself, Andrew McLuhan, here to talk to you all. As you all know, Andrew is the grandson of Marshall McLuhan, who has inspired much of the thinking around this festival. His father, Eric McLuhan, was Marshall's eldest son and who worked with Marshall from the mid-60s until Marshall died in 1980. And from 1980 until his death in 2018, Eric continued the work he began with his father. Now, Andrew is taking up the charge and continuing the family legacy and upholding these really important ideas and also adapting them for the future. I think I'll leave it at that, and I'll let Andrew speak to you all now. Enjoy.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here in the Flechette Gray area where I've been teaching virtually for the last 2 years. I'm going to read part of a larger work, which I've kind of been working on. I've been thinking about it for several years. Recently, with some generous assistance from Reggie James and Eternal in New York City, I was able to do some hard work on it. It's 2 parts. I'm going to read the first part, which is kind of setting the stage for the second part, which is very practical things. It's called Maelstrom Escape Strategies. And the subtitle for purposes of this talk is Diagnosis Before Prescription. I rely heavily on quotes from Marshall and Eric McLuhan, and in order to not break the flow, I'm just going to say quote, and if you want to know where things are from, you can ask me afterward. This is my very advanced graphic design work here. Eric starts, "The problem faced by any explorer in our time, as McLuhan observed, is to invent tools that reveal the current situation, not to make logical connected statements." Quote, "Connected sequential discourse, which is thought of as rational, is really visual. It has nothing to do with reason as such. Reasoning does not occur on single planes or in a continuous connected fashion. The mind leapfrogs. It put things together in all sorts of proportions and ratios instantly. To put down thoughts in coded lineal ways was a discovery of the Greek world. It is not done this way, for example, in the Chinese world, but to deny that the Chinese have access to reason would be ridiculous. They do not have rational discourse at all by Western standards. They reason by the act of interval, not by the act of connection. In the electric age, we are moving into a world where not the connection, but the interval becomes the crucial event in organization." Quote, "In today's rapidly changing environment, people have 2 major concerns: to discover the new problems this environment poses and to develop ways of coping with these problems. We now become aware of the possibility of arranging the entire human environment as a work of art designed to maximize perception and to make everyday learning a process of discovery. Quote, by studying the pattern of the effects of this huge vortex of energy in which we're involved, it may be possible to program a strategy of evasion and survival." As early as 1951, in his The Mechanical Bride, Folklore of Industrial Man, Marshall McLuhan drew inspiration from Edgar Allan Poe's 1841 short story, A Descent into the Maelstrom. In it, Poe's narrator describes how he was sucked into a giant ocean vortex or maelstrom, and by keeping his wits about him, by studying the action of his environment, was able to formulate and execute an escape strategy, and he lived to tell the tale. Quote, "Pattern recognition in the midst of a huge, overwhelming, destructive force is the way out of the maelstrom. The huge vortices of energy created by our media present us with possibilities of evasion of destruction. By studying the pattern of the effects of this huge vortex of energy in which we are involved, it may be possible to program a strategy of evasion and survival." It is one of Marshall's enduring metaphors which he would deploy over and over during his career, and it boils down to this, that we are not helpless. Despair is optional, as is survival. In Poe's story, a fisherman and his two brothers flirt with disaster one too many times and are rewarded as expected. Two brothers are lost, but one survives. And this should sound familiar. In pursuit of wealth, they take great risks, and eventually they can't avoid the seemingly inevitable. It's a numbers game and a numbness game. Marshall McLuhan's hope was that the analogy holds all the way through to today. There's little doubt that we are in the midst of a terrible vortex. The signs are all around us that all is not well. Poe's sailor had the advantage, a dubious comfort, that the cause of his misery was quite obvious. However, the cause of our misery is less clear. We don't know who discovered water, but we know it wasn't a fish. We're battling less the forces of Mother Nature and more the forces of our own nature. It is in our nature to be ignorant of many things, our heads stuck in the sand, as if ignorance somehow frees us from responsibility. However, ignorance of causes is not freedom of effects. It may be well to ask whether we need to remain in this state and whether we can afford to. Quote, we can think things out before we put them out. It's an odd thing. Marshall didn't always believe that we could do very much. He wasn't always of the opinion that, quote, determinism is the result of the behavior of those who are determined to ignore what is happening. In an essay from 1955, he said, improvements in the means of communication are usually based on a shift from one sense to another, and this involved a rapid refocusing in all previous experience. It is therefore a simple maxim of communication study that any change in the means of communication will produce a chain of revolutionary consequences at every level of culture and politics. But here's the kicker, he adds, because of the complexity of the components of this process, prediction and control are not possible. So in 1955, he felt that these things were too complicated in order for us mere mortals to understand, and we don't really have a hope of control. But in 1960, he wrote that we could, quote, study the modes of the media in order to hoik all assumptions out of the subliminal, nonverbal realm for scrutiny and for prediction and control of human purposes. So what happened? How did Marshall McLuhan go from helpless to hopeful? What made him turn around and dive headfirst into the maelstrom? In 1958, Marshall McLuhan was given a grant from the National Association of Educational Broadcasters in Washington, D.C., to develop a curriculum for high school students for the, quote, study of new media. He took a sabbatical from his position at St. Michael's College, where he was an English professor, and spent the next year and a bit deconstructing media and constructing methods for their study. Quote, recognition of the psychic and social consequences of technology makes it possible to neutralize the effects of innovation. Quote, there is absolutely no inevitability as long as we are willing to contemplate the situation. The NAEB grant gave him the means to study the modes of the media, and it was this work which would give him much of the foundation from which he built his methods. It was here that he turned communication study into media study by a vast broadening of the category of what a medium is. From an extension, quote, the personal and social consequences of any medium, that is, of any extension of ourselves, result from the new scale that is introduced into human affairs by each extension of ourselves or by any new technology. From an extension to an environment, quote, the medium is the message because the environment transforms our perceptions, governing the areas of attention and neglect alike. There is no kind of technology, from speech to clothes to satellites to computers, that does not constitute an environment of services and disservices. From an extension to an environment to everything a human makes or does. Quote, everything that man makes and does, every process, every style, every artifact, every poem, song, painting, gimmick, gadget, theory, technology, every product of human effort, unquote. Some might argue that the category broadens so far as to be meaningless, but I would suggest that it broadens it far enough to be meaningful. Quote, "The present book, in seeking to understand many media, the conflicts from which they spring, and the even greater conflicts to which they give rise, holds out the promise of reducing these conflicts by an increase in human autonomy." An increase in human autonomy. Quote, "It is now perfectly plain to me that all media are environments. All media have the effects that geographers and biologists have associated with environments in the past. The medium is the message because the environment transforms our perceptions, governing the areas of attention and neglect alike." The relation of environment to anti-environment. Somewhere after Understanding Media was published in 1964, Marshall McLuhan took what I call an environmental turn. In his 1965 essay, The Relation of Environment to Anti-Environment, it marks this perceptual shift to seeing the, quote, "psychic and social effects of technologies" as an environment of services and disservices as environments. As it happens, Marshall was yet to realize that this perceptual shift had occurred as a result of Sputnik, as the inevitability of ecological thinking applied to his own work in studying the nature of human innovation. Quote, "As any new technology, any extension or amplification of human faculties when given material embodiment tends to create a new environment. This is as true of clothing as of speech or script or wheel." A crucial feature of this essay is the promotion of the artist from a supplier of aesthetic objects to an indispensable agent of perceptual awareness. This is one of the big dilemmas in the whole project: how to make known the unknown. How do you perceive what you can't perceive? Quote, "It is useful to notice all of the arts and sciences as acting in the role of anti-environments that enable us to perceive the environment. When we live in a museum without walls, or has music as a structural part of our sensory environment, new strategies of attention and perception have to be created." This notion of anti-environment is very useful. I often think of comedians as anti-environmentalists of this sort. For example, Jerry Seinfeld, who seems to have built a career on perception, and he's always saying, "You ever notice that?" Street artists are also great at getting us to notice things we don't generally notice. Banksy, for example, once did a play on Vermeer's Girl with a Pearl Earring. He picked a rather plain-looking brick wall which featured a round object, I think it was a security alarm, and used it as the pearl earring, and he recreated Vermeer's piece around it. What strategies might we employ to notice what's happening to us? What's become habitual beneath our notice? Quote, "Our typical response to a disrupting new technology is to recreate the old environment instead of heeding the new opportunities of the new environment. We generally use the new thing to do the job of the old thing before discovering what the new things can do with the new thing. It's artists who are out there on the edge exploring the possibilities, and they rarely get any thanks. What they produce is often an insult to the sensibilities of the people who are set in ways formed by earlier technologies. The funny thing is that what seems edgy today will frequently seem tame tomorrow." Quote, "The artist as a maker of anti-environments permits us to perceive that much is newly environmental and therefore most active in transforming situations. It was his contention that when it's invisible, it's invincible. We can't break a habit we don't know we have. We can't address an effect when we don't know its cause." Quote, "There is a deep-seated repugnance in the human breast against understanding the processes in which we are involved. Such understanding involves far too much responsibility," he wrote to his friend Jacques Maritain. I'm not sure we're as afraid of responsibility now as we once were. The new generation of people leading innovation seem much less motivated by money, much less at the mercy of greed, and much more sincere in wanting to create a better world for all. The medium, or environment, is the message. It's an odd thing. The medium is the message, 5 seemingly straightforward words, and yet they've caused much confusion and bluster. What do you mean the medium is the message? The message is the message. He was interviewed once, and Newman, the interviewer, said, "Why is the medium the message? Why is not the message the message?" To which Marshall replied, "Where would you look for the message in an electric light? The medium and the message are the same." You might be able to break people down into two basic categories when it comes to the medium as the message, or for that matter, when it comes to McLuhan work at all. One group of people will encounter a statement like that and say it doesn't make any sense and move on. Another will encounter it and say it doesn't make any sense and move in. Juicy pieces of meat. Content matters a lot. But the medium doesn't carry the content as much as the content carries the medium. One of the major keys to decoding McLuhan is to always keep in mind that he was an English professor, an expert in modernist poetry, and he was, in several senses, a poet himself. This can make people uncomfortable for some reason. They have a hard time reconciling the facts, so they either discount it or dismiss him. The relative irony here is Marshall was very much concerned with content. He made his living teaching poetry and writing books. Metaphors were his bread and butter. Media study was sort of his side hustle. Quote, "My study of literature became an aid to the perception that led me to undertake the task of understanding the relation between culture and technology." A favorite poet of Marshall's was T.S. Eliot, who wrote, I think in 1933, "The chief use of the meaning of a poem in the ordinary sense may be, for here again I'm speaking of some kinds of poetry and not all, to satisfy one habit of the reader, to keep his mind diverted and quiet while the poem does its work upon him, much as the imaginary burglar is always provided with a nice piece of meat for the house dog." It was also Eliot who said, "Amateur poets borrow, mature poets steal." The actual quote is a little bit different, and it's worth looking at. It's from Eliot's essay on Philip Massinger in The Secret Wood, if you want to look it up. 30 years after Eliot wrote that, Marshall used it and said, in Understanding Media, "For the content of a medium is like the juicy piece of meat carried by the burglar to distract the watchdog of the mind," which I feel is a hilarious callback to Eliot's essay on Massinger and his insertion that, quote, "good poets make it into something better, or at least something different." But distract. For what purpose? And what's being stolen? Eliot in 33 and McLuhan in 64 are talking about the same thing, only McLuhan takes it out of poetry and into the broader world of human innovation. Quote, "The effects of new media on our sensory lives are similar to the effects of new poetry. They change not our thoughts, but the structure of our world." Eliot is saying that while we read poetry, poetry rearranges our sensibility, and that this happens while we're involved with or distracted by the content of the poem. It happens on the side, on the sly. McLuhan is saying that technologies, poetry being a technology, a human innovation, rearrange our sensibilities, and this happens while we're busy creating, consuming, critiquing, arguing about, even pointedly ignoring the content. Actually, ignoring it is about the worst thing you can do. The medium is the message, the massage. It is what it does. It's not that content is irrelevant. It's that the main effect doesn't come from the content. It comes from how we are changed individually and societally because of the presence of these technological extensions of ourselves. Ignoring it only gives it absolute power. Content is that juicy piece of meat which keeps us busy, and this is why media literacy, while important, is of limited value. Zoom and tools like it have equally changed work and much more, regardless of where you work or what your work entails. It's changed the office, it's changed the home. If you don't leave home for work, you don't come home from work. And it's changed everything between work and home. It's changed you. Another juicy piece of meat is when we spend undue time debating about whether a given technology is good or bad. It's not that we shouldn't have these discussions, but that they are beside the point, because how we feel about something like that has nothing to do with its effect on us. Quote, "The effects of technology do not occur at the level of opinions or concepts, but alter sense ratios or patterns of perception steadily and without resistance." There's a lot more, but I'm a little out of time, and I'm out of town. And I just want to say a bit about part 2. So this was kind of setting up the main event, which is Maelstrom escape strategies. And the idea is that, to use Edgar Allan Poe's analogy, we're in this technological vortex, and what do we do about it? And the way I see it, it's 3 things. First, we need to escape, because we're kind of in the middle of it and not doing so great. We need to survive. So, we need to take care of ourselves and put ourselves in a position where we can escape. And then only from a position of escape or relative safety can we think about avoidance, not getting into them in the future. And my overall point with this is that Marshall McLuhan went from believing that these processes were too complicated, human innovation, too complicated to understand and hope to control, to, after spending over a year deeply studying them, deciding that, well, actually, we can, if we study them, maybe have some hope of controlling them. And I think we can not only do that today, but we're getting so deep down the vortex that we kind of have to. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Andrew.
You're welcome.
Something that has really let's move over to this side of the stage.
Sure.
Something that has become, really clear through looking through the amazing documents from your archive is that, Marshall had a real frustration at the time with the global elite not listening and not paying attention. He regularly called them somnambulists in his writing, saying they were sleepwalking through some of the most important things that were happening around them. And it's really funny to go through the archive because all of the things that people were saying back to him, you hear repeated every day about the internet, about video games, about TikTok, you name it. Yeah. So I'm wondering, how are you feeling in this current moment where there are clearly so many important messages in this work that may or may not actually be being internalized by their intended recipients?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Is this thing on? Cool. The overall feeling I have, and maybe it doesn't seem rational, is hope. And the thing is people a lot smarter than me have realized that we can do better than we're doing. And there are a few reasons I have hope. For one, when Marshall McLuhan first said the medium is the message in 1958, people thought he was crazy. And for quite a while after, and actually a lot of people still think he's crazy. But I can do a class on the medium as a message, and within about 5 or 10 minutes, people are like, yeah, well, that makes sense. It's kind of obvious. So I think we've caught up a lot cognitively to where we can accept ideas like that. And the other thing is that I believe that human ingenuity has gotten us into these messes, and human ingenuity can get us out of them as well. And it seems kind of ridiculous to take something somebody wrote in 1841 as a fictional short story and use it today practically. But Marshall believed that the parallels were one-to-one, that by studying the patterns of the vortices of power in which we're emerged, we can plan escape strategies. And so, yeah, I'm hopeful.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrew. Thanks for coming all the way down from Canada to be with us.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, we appreciate it.